Hey everyone, it's Natalie Bencavanga, and welcome to Facts Over Fear. On this show, I'm always trying to work to connect the dots, to, of course, strip away the fear mongering and get down to the facts. I want to take us on a little journey here. Let's go back to 1989 just for a moment. There was a legal scholar, Kimberlé Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. It's an analytical framework that shows how social and political identities can overlap to create unique combinations of discrimination and of privilege. Now, rather than looking at something, a single trait in isolation, we're examining instead multiple systems of power and how they're intersecting simultaneously. And it's that framework that I really want to bring to today's conversation. Now, in Pittsburgh, a little town near where I grew up in Springdale, is seeing devastating examples of what happens when harmful systems of power that may on the surface seem unrelated overlap and cause potential harm to communities. A new public source investigation led by Jamie Wigan, who is with me today, Charlie Wolfson, and Stephanie Strasberg dives into ICE, a data center, and a town divided as national battles over ICE and data centers collide with local questions around policing, power, and accountability. Something I'm sure we're going to be able to work through in the next 20 minutes. Jamie, it's so nice to connect with you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Natalie. Good to be here.
Absolutely. I wish at some point you and I get to have like a real lighthearted conversation one of these days. But for now, I think the work that you guys are doing, and I always use you as your organization, Public Source, is sort of this beacon of light in the great investigative work that's happening over there. And I always encourage people to check it out. And when I saw this story, it really hit home for me because of, like I said, there are so many layers here intersecting and things that may not seem connected. I am finding connections in. So can you talk a little bit about why you guys chose to dive deep into Springdale and what you've uncovered?
Well, I'd say it was somewhat accidental. The first time I'd been to Springdale, I've lived obviously in and around the Pittsburgh area for about 12 years now. The first time I went to Pittsburgh was in December when the council was passing this vote to approve the data center. And went there thinking, okay, this is where the story, ends essentially, and I'll go home and I'll write it up. And I, had no reason to think I'd be back in Springdale anytime soon. But a curious thing happened when we were there, covering that. A few days earlier, my former colleague, Quinn Glubicki, had reported on a couple of local police departments who had passed these 287G task force agreements with ICE. And Springdale were one of three at that time. And that was the first time anybody in the community had learned about it. We didn't get that information through Springdale officials. We got it through tracking the ICE information on the federal website. So there was one resident who showed up to that meeting where they were mostly talking about the data center and brought up this question of the task force agreement, and they had a concern about why it hadn't been sort of brought up in public and voted on during a public meeting. So that was sort of an interesting thing in the back of our minds. And then a couple of months later, there was an arrest of a resident who's well known in the community and has two children in the school district, and that kind of prompted a lot of kind of backlash and some protests, and then down the road, some arrests ensuing, and lots of chaos and drama, and we just kind of kept going, showing up at each point along the way, and then over time there was this was all pointing to a deeper story. What happens when essentially two of the most sort of divisive national issues converge in one small square mile borough, and that was happening in Springdale. So we decided to go deep and see how we could sort of join the dots and put together some deeper reporting on this.
No, I really appreciate it because these are the small towns that I think are often left out of the conversation. And it's also spaces in which I think there's sort of the sacrificial lamb in a lot of, larger regions and communities, like, oh, no one will really notice what's going on over there. And so when you guys put this spotlight on there, all I could think of was Wow, why Springdale? So in your opinion, having spoken to a lot of the residents that live in that community and the leaders over in that space, why do you think this area was sort of ripe for both the data centers moving in and also this ICE presence?
Well, I think there's a certain element of just coincidence, but I think there's also another element, and this is kind of what we, you know, tried to drill into, at least in my part of the two-part series, which was, um, the common concerns that residents are pointing to is like a lack of trust they feel in their local government, and a sense that there's a lack of transparency and accountability. So there's kind of two kind of main groups who are sort of mobilizing, one more focused on the ICE issue and one more focused on the data center. And there's a little bit of overlap, but both of them are kind of showing up frequently at public meetings now and expressing, concern. And one of the major events that happened was a few months back. Actually, the same person who brought up the question about the ICE agreement that we reported on continued speaking out during meetings. And during one of those, he was forcefully arrested by the borough and charged with two felonies and a string of misdemeanors. The DA has since dropped them on lack of evidence. But so there's definitely a lot of hostility between some of the residents and the government. And to the extent that there is a connection between these sort of very different themes, the question about who makes decisions, who takes responsibility and accountability seems to be at the heart of them both.
If you're just joining me, I'm Natalie Bencavanga. I'm chatting with Pittsburgh's public source journalist and deputy editor, Jamie Wigan, and we're talking about a little town called Springdale that is really making the headlines right now. In the article that I read on Public Source's website that you were a part of, you illustrated a timeline in Springdale that really started in 2023, I believe, with the implosion of the smokestack and this sort of look to a cleaner future. What has happened in your mind between that implosion that has led to this development to replace it with this data center? Or can you walk us through a little bit about what happened with that dramatic event?
So, I mean, before the implosion, the power plant there had been, a big part of the community for good and for bad, you could say. It obviously provided a lot of jobs and was part of the sort of the identity and the sort of the fabric of the town. But it also was the county's last remaining coal plant, so it put out a lot of smog and pollution, and that obviously had its drawbacks too. So there were definitely people who were there, kind of during the demolition, sort of cheering the end of that, who thought, well, maybe something new can go in here. There was some optimism about housing, or it's the site is about a 50-acre parcel, and it sits right on the riverbed, and it's surrounded kind of by neighborhoods. So there's definitely people who saw potential to maybe create some kind of community asset out of that. So that was obviously one current. I think there would be other people who say, "Hey, we just want something there. We want, whether it's industry or housing or recreation." So I don't know that there'd been a whole lot of discussion about other kind of projects or concepts. But the data center, I think that started to come into the picture sometime last year, and the developers were starting to show up in public meetings around the fall, and that was when some of the local folks caught on, and those who were opposed to it started to kind of form groups of opposition.
Can you talk a little bit about that opposition? What are some of their reasons for not wanting the data centers that you were able to uncover in your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, I think one thing is, you look at this site, and it is very, very close to homes.
Mm,
It's surrounded on multiple sides by residences. So some people are just like, well, I'm just really worried about the noise it's going to make.
yeah.
Then there's the other issue of, what's going to power this. It's going to pull from the grid.
Mm,
As it stands. And that's obviously in Pennsylvania, we already have a shortage, and that's leading to spiking prices. So there's concern about the cost of utilities, and then the fact that it's going to rely on diesel powered generators as a backup source. How frequently is that going to be relied on, and when it is, whether it's a storm or some other cause for an outage, there's going to be over 100 of them, I think. So that's quite a lot. And so that will be churning out, obviously, air pollution as well as noise on top of the regular noise that the data center makes. And then I think there's also just like these are very new. This whole concept of like the hyper data center to support AI, this
Hmm.
fairly new technology, and there's definitely a lot of people who are just like, well, I don't necessarily know
Right.
exactly what it's going to do, but I'm worried because I'm hearing that, in a worst case scenario, that it could have these health effects or it could
Hmm.
have, these other consequences. So there's definitely, I think, just some uncertainty and fear about this is kind of a novel technology, and do we really know what the outcome's going to be? There was one family we talked to who sold their home that they had planned to stay in and raise a family, and they said, ultimately, we don't
Wow.
know how bad it's going to be, but we don't want to take the gamble, so we're going to
Mm.
sell now before we're trapped. Because that's the other thing as well. People worry that it's going to depreciate home values as well.
Well, I think those are all very fair reasons. And I interview a lot of people around this topic as well, Jamie, and those reasons seem to circulate no matter what community you're speaking in, whether it's a local community here or really all around the country. I want to talk about the other side of it. Who is in favor of these data centers, or excuse me, this data center moving into Springdale, and how far in the process is this? And were you able to get a hold of any, leadership officials in the community to talk about it on record?
Well, one of the most interesting things about this is, going back to that vote in December when it was, the final plans were approved. There was a series of processes that led up to that, but that was the final vote that council had to make. I think it was a 5-2 vote, and um, none of them kind of came out and said, yes, this is going to be great for the community. And
Mm.
a
Mm.
handful of the five that did said, basically, I don't want this. We don't want this, but
Okay.
they're gonna sue us if we don't approve it.
Oh.
And that's
Hmm.
because, the developer bought the land, um, before they had any chance to kind of revise their zoning ordinances, which could put limits on,
Mm.
how, how to govern like data center, um, development in their community. So a lot of municipalities across the state are kind of getting caught flat-footed on this
Yeah.
because data centers are a new kind of form of development. And if you've got zoning codes that are 20, 30 years old,
Right.
they don't have the terminology to regulate them. And the way Pennsylvania
Hmm.
law defaults, if you don't have kind of an explicit like if you don't prescribe exactly how and what you can build here, then by default, like it favors the developers essentially.
Hmm.
So that was at least what they're saying they were up against is like the threat of a lawsuit. So we have to approve it. We've gotten some concessions from them. So this is the best of the options. That was generally what they
Wow.
said at the time. I've tried pretty fervently to follow up with most of the folks on council since then, and nobody has spoken to me about it on the record.
Hmm.
And then, yeah, so and broadly, we did, we knocked on some doors around the neighborhood, and we probably came across a handful of people who said, yeah, well, we prefer this over nothing. Nobody who actually wanted to go on record about that, but the majority of people that we talked to oppose it, I would say.
Wow, that's really interesting, and I think it's a hard lesson for a lot of communities. And I've also heard, like I said, similar things around how do communities get educated, basically, around the issues of data centers, so that they can choose how and if they want to change, the way their community functions and runs in anticipation of this happening. And I think it's the kind of reporting that Public Source is doing that provides that space for education. So I appreciate your lens on that and letting people understand how and why these things are happening. So, coupling that with the presence of ICE in this community, I found this to sort of be just quite a boiling point, right? I mean, you have the data center, which, like you said, even the people that approved it are kind of doing it half-heartedly, but it may move forward in some capacity. And at the same time, we know a lot of these data centers for artificial intelligence, in particular generative, they're working in the surveillance state, and then you have this presence of ICE, and it just feels like a layer of pressure on communities that are already feeling that under pressure. What did you gather on the flip side, talking to people about the presence of ICE in their communities? And did anyone sense that as an overlap of just, oh my gosh, all of these things seem to be happening here at once?
Yeah, like I said, there's been kind of two kind of loose kind of groups that have formed. One is more focused around the data center, and is more focused around ICE. And there are definitely people who would say they feel kind of strongly about both issues. But most of them, I think, feel, they only have so much bandwidth, they only have so much
Yeah.
to give. So they've kind of picked a horse, and that's kind of what they're pushing. So yeah, there's definitely a sense that, like, in the last 6 months, this otherwise kind of sleepy town has kind of come alive with these two very divisive issues.
So looking ahead, where does this reporting go next? Because obviously, these two issues with the data center and with ICE in this small town are not probably going away. So, how are you guys using your resources at Public Source to look at this in sort of the next chapter?
Well, I think one thing is that we're just gonna keep showing up. We don't kind of just helicopter in and do a story and then leave. There was an event 2 days ago led by Senator Lindsey Williams and
Hmm.
a nonprofit group about how to kind of create a community benefits agreement. So that's one of the conversations that's happening. The borough meets again, I think, next week, so we'll be there for that, and we expect people will probably continue to voice some of these issues. As far as the data center goes, the it's been, like, approved, like I said, at the local level since December, but it now has to go through Allegheny County's land development process, and it will also probably need to get some environmental permits. So there's definitely some of the opponents are sort of turning their attention now to the county to try and use their channels of oversight. So it's definitely, the story hasn't finished, and we'll kind of continue to follow it and try to report faithfully wherever it leads.
I appreciate you so much, Jamie, and thank you for sharing space and all of the things that you've learned with the audience here at Facts Over Fear. If people want to support the great work of Public Source, where can they go?
Well, they can go to publicsource.org, and if they choose to read us or to support it in any other way, we're always very grateful for that. So thanks for your time today, Natalie. It's been good being here.
Absolutely. I always appreciate having you on. And if you want to support Facts Over Fear, just head to my my profile and you can become a free or paid subscriber so that I can continue connecting with wonderful journalists like Jamie so that we can amplify all of these important pieces across the region and across the country that are impacting all of us. And until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks.